Hello and welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. I'm Joan Kerr. We're coming to you from Film Scene in downtown Iowa City, and we're happy to have you join us for this third part in a three-part series on gender and identity. For those of you who haven't seen this program before, we invite you to join us here in Film Scene for the live production, or you can catch these programs later on UITV, YouTube, or iTunes. Information about upcoming shows as well as links to archived programs can be found at international.uiowa.edu, and you can learn more about Film Scene at icfilmscene.org. The focus of this final segment of our three-part series on gender and identity is human rights. There's a lot to talk about here, and I'm very excited to have these three guests with us on stage. Katie Imborek is just next to me, and she's an assistant professor in the University of Iowa Department of Family Medicine, also co-director of the UIHC's LGBTQ Clinic. So welcome, Katie.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you. And next to Katie is Aniruddha Dutta, assistant professor in the UI Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies. And thank you, Ani, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. And at far end is Lutgendorf, a professor in the University of Iowa Department of Asian and Slavic Languages and Literatures. And great to have you here, Philip. Thanks.
Nice to be with you again, Joan.
Thank you. So the overarching question I'd like to tackle in this segment is, how does gender impact human rights and the rights of citizens, both here in the U.S. and abroad? And I think I'm going to turn first to Katie for some U.S. perspectives here. We've already mentioned that you're involved with the LGBTQ Clinic. Mm-hmm. You teach here. What issues do your patients deal with related to human rights, or what we might think of as citizens' rights?
Right, sure. So we do live in a really great state, and since 2007, the state of Iowa has protected gender identity in things like employment, non-discrimination, and in housing, and in public accommodations. But as we all know, sometimes things that are actually in law don't necessarily be put into practice in quite that same way. So Dr. Knisely and myself have, sort of traded stories about some of these different things that have come up. And as she mentioned in the first segment, we do have a really wonderful partnership with some folks over in the College of Law. Professor Lynn Sandler has done some amazing things. They've created a Rainbow Health Clinic, which specifically has worked with and for some of our transgender patients. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that has come out of that has been a guide to changing legal gender identity documents in the state of Iowa. Mm-hmm. And it's been a really great resource for a lot of our patients, and sort of helping them tackle one of the barriers that they do find is that oftentimes the name that they prefer or the gender that they identify with doesn't necessarily match that's on their birth certificate, their driver's license, their passport, that is in their, listed on their insurance card. So that's just one of the things that we have been able to kind of help with. Many times they need a signed letter from a physician that may need to be notarized and things like that. So we do as much as we can to help them where we can do that, and also to give them that resource. And as I mentioned before about things like non-discrimination laws, sometimes those are not put into practice. Sometimes we do have patients who come and say, I was fired from my job. I have been to multiple interviews and I can't get a job. And oftentimes the assumption is it's because of things like that person's gender expression, their gender identity, and maybe they didn't get the job for other reasons, or they were fired for other reasons, but that's sort of how it's sort of felt by that patient. And so, of course, without employment, you don't have really great access to health insurance. And so we know that folks who identify as transgender or gender nonconforming don't always have great access to health care, and that could be one of the reasons why. Mm-hmm. So those are just some of the few day-to-day things that our trans patients have to deal with, and I think it's important for us to kind of recognize our privilege as cisgender folks, that we can go and feel like we have to go to the bathroom, and we know that we're going to find one that matches our gender, and that we can feel pretty secure that we're not going to be fired from our job for trying to identify in a way that resonates with who we are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wow, it must be. I mean, sometimes these stories have to be heartbreaking.
They are. But I'd have to say that, every Tuesday night when I leave the LGBTQ clinic, I definitely don't feel heartbroken. I feel empowered by the stories of resilience that I hear. And these patients have sometimes do come with very tragic stories of, loss of their friends or loss of their family, but they often have such resilience to sort of make it through, and sometimes just to get to our doors, they have really had to show such courage and such dedication that it's always much more heartwarming than it is heartbreaking.
There was a story, I don't know how many people may have read this, but a few weeks ago there was a young woman who died at an early age, I think 29, in Boise, Idaho, and she had worked, I think, in a bank in Boise, if either of you read this story, any of you did. In any case, she was known to her friends, people in Boise, as a young woman named Jennifer, and anyway, she died very suddenly, unexpectedly, and when friends attended the funeral, an open casket funeral, they saw her in a way they'd never seen her before, hair cut short, dressed as a young man, and the name on the program that was handed out by the family was the birth name. This young woman had been born a male, and the father, I would imagine against the wishes of this young woman, saw her as the boy who had been born all those years before. And in the article there was an explanation that if a person does identify with a different gender, it's very important to get this down in a document somewhere that will have to be observed upon your death. If it's very sad for me to hear this story.
And it's things like that where there's just so many things that could happen on a day-by-day basis that really trans folks or folks who are gender nonconforming have to go to those extra steps, have to hire the lawyer, have to run around and find their birth certificate from the state that they were born, and sort of go through all of these processes just to protect something as simple as you would think that it would be to be able to, have your final wishes be carried out.
Well, so thank you, Katie. And I think now I'd like to move down to Philip and to Ani and talk a little bit about a different culture. India, an interesting Supreme Court ruling from some months ago recognizing officially a third gender. And Ani can fill us in on what this ruling was all about and the background to it.
Thank you, Joan. So this ruling, the Supreme Court, it's actually the NALSA judgment. It was a judgment in response to a petition filed by the National Legal Services Authority, or NALSA. And this ruling did kind of expand upon legal options for identifying other than male and female, which had already been available previously, so it was not an entirely new development. But what was perhaps more innovative about the ruling in itself was that it, for the first time, on the level of the state or the law, it recognized some degree of self-determination of gender. And it said that people should be able to, this is in the directives at the end of the judgment, it said that people should be able to choose their gender identity as male, female, or other, irrespective of the sex assigned at birth, and whether or not they've undergone any transitional procedures such as surgery or hormones. So that was the truly, I think, radical possibility of the judgment, which was kind of reductively portrayed in a lot of the both Indian national media coverage and the international coverage, which basically focused on creating a third gender identity, which actually already existed in, for instance, the Indian election voter ID card process. There was already another category that had been introduced. In the passport, there had been previously in 2005, a similar kind of third gender category had been introduced. So there have been these administrative measures happening for a while now. So the Supreme Court judgment was not entirely unique or the first step. And in other neighboring South Asian countries like Nepal and Bangladesh, there also have been similar separate gender or third gender categories that have been proposed and to some degree implemented. Although implementation is a different story, I won't be able to go into the details of that. Like, it's one thing creating a legal option and then actually getting it procedurally implemented on the level of identity cards or census enumeration or whatever is a different story. So that's one way in the in which the third gender judgment was kind of reductively portrayed. It also has some problems of its own. It's, in some respects, it's not entirely it's clear in terms of what are the procedures that one might have to follow to legally declare identification. So in the directives, it says that transitional procedures should not be required. In fact, it says that it's a violation of one's fundamental rights if transitional procedures are required for gender self-determination. But in other parts, it seems to make the identification process contingent on psychological testing or some kind of demonstration of intent to transition. So that kind of seems to limit its potential in other places. So it's a little bit contradictory. It also seems to focus more on trans feminine people, particularly trans women and hijras, who have been culturally usually recognized as a separate or a third gender. So there has been some controversy after the judgment regarding whether trans-masculine spectrum people are really, are affected by the judgment, whether they also fall into the purview of the judgment, which is regrettable. But so that, in some ways, it's still a kind of story that's being worked out. But it does set certain important precedents in terms of, setting into motion this idea of self-determination of gender into legal procedure, how that can work in terms of legal procedure. And there is also a larger kind of background to this, culturally, historically, of course. So India has had a long history of particularly visible trans feminine communities, that is, communities of people who are assigned male at birth, but or sometimes rarely intersex at birth, and who identify in some ways as feminine, sometimes as women, sometimes as a separate gender, but some degree of feminine self-identification. And often culturally or historically, these have been kind of accorded the space of a separate or a third gender. So that is itself a complicated term, because there are people who might just wish to identify as the quote-unquote opposite gender, which is why it's important to have gender self-determination and not to impose a kind of third gender category on everyone, because not everyone might identify as a separate gender. So personally, I am femme, genderqueer, and I am, I'm also Koti, which is a community of trans feminine persons closely related to the Hijra community. So a lot of Kotis become Hijras, which is a more kind of organized subculture, and with its certain specific religio-cultural norms and professions. So I am fine with a separate gender or third gender identity, but a lot of people in my community are not. They would either identify as female or sometimes even male. So because these are trans feminine spectrum, So and the other thing in India is that the contrast between trans and Hijra and Koti activism in India and trans activism in the US, it's really very interesting because it demonstrates the way in which gender is, of course, about self-identification, but it's also about social grids of intelligibility. So to explain that a little more, it's about what are the categories that are available to you to understand your own experiences and feelings. So if you culturally have a separate gender category available, many more people are amenable to identify with that if there is no, as opposed to a context where there is no such category available, right? So which is why in India, it's been far more common for trans people, I think, to claim a separate gendered category, than it has been in the US, where I think in many ways non-binary people remain a relatively marginalized part of the trans community, which is itself also marginalized within the larger LGBTIQ community. So this scenario is in many ways reversed in India, where a kind of separate gender identification is much more common. And also in many ways in India, especially these trans feminine spectrum communities that I've been talking about, they also blur a lot of the kind of ways in which we think of gender in the US. So even within LGBT communities in the US, for instance, the cis versus trans divide. Koti trans feminine spectrum communities have historically and today consisted of people whom in the US might be identified as feminine homosexual males or feminine gay men, and also trans women, and also what we might call here drag queens or cross-dressers. And so it's a whole spectrum, but it kind of coalesces into a singular community, and there are subcategories like Bheli Kotis are Kotis who dress more consistently in feminine attire. Kodi Kotis are Kotis who might be more akin to feminine gay men, something. So there are all these kind of finer gradations, but it forms a kind of community of its own, And similarly, and hijras and kotis are also overlapping, so there are like divisions among hijras as well, like akwan hijras, nirvan hijras, depending on what kind of physical transition you might have done or not done.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to remember that it's like really a lot about the kind of cultural context that you grew up in, and what are the kind of categories and terms available to you, and how are they gendered. Like, even in looking at US history, you can see this. It's not just about India. So like, pink went from being a relatively masculine color to a feminine color, over the late 19th to the early 20th century. Then in the late 19th century in the US and UK, there were subcultures of feminine, homosexual, male-assigned people who in some ways they were the kind of forerunners of gay men today, but also identified as a separate gender in some cases, like the Unanists. But these kind of categories have shifted. And in the US, LGB have become defined in terms of sexual orientation, become more gender normative and more rigidly distinguished from transgender, whereas in India, this has not happened, and there are other ways of thinking about and categorizing gender and sexuality.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, let me draw Philip into this as well. You teach Hindi and modern Indian history and so on, and you also teach these great epic tales with characters that every Indian child grows up knowing something about. What has been the understanding over the long, long period of time of gender fluidity that might be related through these tales?
Yeah, well, kind of building on something that Ani said, I mean, I think to some extent people's ability to imagine different possibilities of gender depends upon the kind of stories that they've heard. And the most consistent thing in my study of India, from ancient epics to modern-day Bollywood epics, has really been a fascination with storytelling and with the abundance of storytelling in India and the possibilities that it presents. And you do find a fair amount of stories, both in classical literature and in folklore, that question gender, that question ideas of gender. You have characters who change, who are transgender. In the great epic Mahabharata, which is one of the foundational Sanskrit epic traditions, you have a woman who becomes a man, who becomes, in order to play a role in the war and become a warrior on the battlefield, and she literally transitions, and it's a famous story, very well known. And you also have one of the main heroes of that epic, who is a super macho guy who becomes, it's not entirely clear what Arjuna becomes, Ani, right? I mean, he becomes neuter, but feminine attired and feminine mannerisms, and becomes a dancing teacher to a bunch of princesses for a year. And it's almost a kind of tour de force performance of sort of the woman inside him being allowed to manifest as part of this heroic personality who's actually one of the most admired figures in the epic. But it's not, I mean, there are comical aspects to it, but it's not generally played for laughs. It's a kind of a serious transformation, and so anyway, that's one. Those are a couple of examples, and then of course in Hindu religious tradition you have the notion of androgyny of divinity. So Shiva, for example, one of the most revered and beloved gods in Hinduism, regularly appears in a hermaphroditic form, where he's half woman and half male. And so again, I mean, these are models, and in their own way they can reinforce the dyadic notion of either or gender, but they can also be subjected to other, and have been, to other interpretations that involve more fluidity.
Well, no, during the period of the British colonial empire, I would imagine that the British understanding of gender conflicted in some way with some of the Hindu expressions.
Yeah, and of course when you say British, you really have to say Victorian British.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about a very particular period of uptightness, so to say. There was a tendency in discourse, in the colonial discourse in India, to gender the entire operation. India was feminine, Britain was masculine. Indians were effeminized as the subject conquered people to manly British Christian virile culture.
Yeah.
And this is a kind of pervasive discourse that you find in a lot of colonial expressions, cultural expressions. And of course, Indians reacted to that in their own way. There was a tendency for Indian men to want to fight this, reject this, reassert their masculinity in a kind of hyper-masculine way. So that led to a kind of hardening, reifying of gender categories, I would say, in some contexts. One thing I'd like to mention is also in the Hindu tradition, there are certain devotional traditions, quite prominent, quite mainstream devotional traditions, in which it's understood that there's only one male in the universe, and that's God. Of course, there are also Hindu traditions in which God is feminine, emphatically the goddess, but there is this notion that God is male and all souls are female in relation to God, and therefore devotees often assume feminine roles, feminine voices, occasionally feminine dress in worshiping God, and this is an old tradition, long-standing tradition, which of course the Victorians thought was perverse and you know, against nature and so on.
Yeah, yeah. Would you imagine that, you mentioned Bangladesh and was it Nepal, who have also had this sort of third gender ratification in a way. Would you expect that this will be something that will move all across the globe? I mean, I haven't heard any public discussion in this country about national level third gender declarations. Would you expect that such things will happen?
I guess it might, because even in some Western countries, I think, or like more Anglophone countries like New Zealand, I think, there you do have options for declaring gender neutrality, if not a separate gender in identification. And this has been kind of, I think in Australia also there's been a judgment which tries to do something similar. So this has been happening in other countries as well. I think ideally, though, finally, in some ways, depending on what is the context, gender identity should not be such a basic marker of social differentiation. This is not to say that it's not important. For many people, it's personally important. But like, it shouldn't be such an important marker, say, on a whole host of identifications where it might not be that relevant, because that creates a whole lot of problems, you know, and you just end up like expanding this bureaucracy around gender, which in some ways is needless. So in certain cases, of course, in say medical contexts, it might be relevant. You know, in some contexts like affirmative action, it might be relevant because people who are assigned female or, you know, who are transgender or whatever might experience greater discrimination, and there needs to be redress specifically catered for those people. But apart from such contexts, I think there are a lot of social contexts in which gender identity need not be that relevant or that basic to social identification. And in that ways, you know, that might just facilitate just more easy and fluid identifications, whichever way one wants to identify or not identify, you know.
Wow. Well, thank you all. This has been really very, very interesting to me, and I thank you all for joining us. Katie Imborek is next to me here, Aniruddha Dutta next to her, and Philip Lutgendorf at the end. Thank you so much, and I thank all of you for coming, being with us this afternoon, and please join us here at Film Scene in January. Our next program after the new year will be on January 20th, and the topic is Food for Thought, and we hope you can join us for that. Find these WorldCanvass programs on UITV, on YouTube, and on iTunes, and the International Programs website, international.uiowa.edu. So I'm Joan Kerr. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon, and we'll see you next time. Good night.